So, Ani, hello, welcome everybody. This is the Indigenous perspectives and understandings of invasive species, and told through the eyes of Phragmites, and this is something that's really fun that I've started doing. This is me actually switching off the Western science side of my brain and actually only focusing through my Indigenous side and my Indigenous knowledge systems, and I usually share with people I get to work with, and I'm pretty happy to be here today. This is not an overly long presentation, so I actually want to have a dialogue with people through questions and answers, if we can do that. Um, but please be reminded, it wasn't long ago, it would have been illegal for me to come and share my knowledge through Indigenous perspectives with all of you about conservation and ecological management. So I thank all of you from the bottom of my heart for coming today to listen to me speak. Keeping with our traditions, I will introduce myself in our language and with my traditional name. And my Indigenous name is Giniw, which means the golden eagle. And I've been asked to watch over the lands and waters. I come from a community called the Skijamong, or Curve Lake First Nation, which is just north of Peterborough in Ontario. And I'm a member of the Otter Clan, who specializes. That clan actually specializes in Indigenous and settler relations, and actually that's what I actually do. And in my real world, as well as being a biologist. I'd actually like to acknowledge that I'm in the my home territory of the Chippewas and Mississaugas of the Williams Treaty, and I'm sitting in Treaty 18 today. So it is winter, and it is a very important time for the Mississauga people to go and tell stories about the land and ecological management, and how we're actually going to continue our livelihood and our lifestyle. And we usually tell this to our young people during the winter months. And in our culture, it's an ancient and important art, and it's how we pass our teachings from one generation to the next. So that's kind of what we're going to do today. I'm going to tell you about some of our traditional teachings that are often mislooked um, in Western science and ecological management of the landscape. And I often do this actually this time of year to my kids and my nieces and nephews, because they tend to spend a lot of time with us, and they tend to give me the full attention. And when Indigenous people refer to things like traditional teachings, I would like ask people to remember that's not just viewed as a story like the ones that you might purchase at chapters or read in a magazine, but these are the laws that have governed this land for 15,000 years. While it's only been the last 587 years that things have become out of balance, and some of the challenges we've had in ecological integrity. We did tell stories though just for, all year long for people's knowledge, but the winters when we actually got together and told stories, and with the amount of snow we've had recently in southern Ontario, I thought this was best to do it in this format. I shared with my daughter the other day that traditional stories can only be some stories can only be told in the winter when there is deep snow on the ground. The snow is significant because there are some tales that you don't want to be telling when the animals and other spirits are out to hear you. When there's snow on the ground, you know the animals are hibernating, and you know the spirits are sleeping, so they can't hear you, and that's why we talk about them. And then all Indigenous people have to wait all year round for these stories to be told. So I'm glad that you're here today. So I'm going to start with the traditional teaching of all our relations, and some of these laws I'll share with you today. I call them the forgotten laws of governance, and this forgotten law of governance started around 1763 with the signing of the Royal Proclamation, and up to that point, Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people lived in harmony under our natural law and governance. It was the signing of the Royal Proclamation that really started causing problems, not only for the Indigenous people, but the environment as well. So here's a teaching about all our relations. So Indigenous peoples are caretakers of Mother Earth and realize and respect her gifts of water, air, and fire. Indigenous peoples have a special relationship with the earth and all living things in it. This relationship is based on a profound spiritual connection to Mother Earth that has guided our people to practice humility and reciprocity in all our activities. It's also based on the subsistence needs and values extending back tens of thousands of years. Hunting, gathering, and fishing to secure food, preserve ourselves, families, and elderly, the widows, and the community, and for ceremonial purposes. Everything is taken and used with the understanding that we can only take what we need, and we must use great care and be aware how we take things and how much of it, so the future generations will not be put in peril. All My Relations is the teaching that is a first reminder of who we are and all our relations with both our natural family and our relatives, but also to all human beings on this planet. We even extend this relationship to go further with the web of kinship to all animals, the birds or the winged ones, the fish, the scaled ones, and to the plants. And it forms this integral marriage of the web of life. All My Relations is encouraged for us to accept the responsibilities we have within the universal family of living beings in a harmonious and moral manner to this earth. Another law that we don't often talk about uh, when we start doing conservation planning is natural law. Our worldview as Indigenous people maintains that within nature, it can be kind and generous, one of strength. Um, of natural law is that everything that nature does is absolute. Um, natural law is evident and clear and allows no room for compromise. For example, any person who stays outside on a cold winter's night without proper clothing will freeze to death. Any creature, whether it be a dog, a deer, a person, a flea, or even a tick, if they don't eat and drink, they will die. Natural law prevails around the rulings of any human law. It is simple, basic, and eternal, like the circle of life itself. Humans who live within natural law will live well because because nature provides all that is needed for the essentials of life. The first peoples of this land believed that these laws of the natural world would be shared closely and observed to guide all our human behaviors. After all, most creation stories describe the human position in the world as being a humble one. Humans are not intended to conquer and control the natural world, but to live in harmony within it. And the final law that I never see talked about anymore is a law of mutual support. And that one is for peoples who live on the land, whether it be Indigenous people or non-Indigenous people. The demands of daily life require that people work together with the natural world, not against it, or against each other and all those other beings who occupy that space. Traditional peoples lived within the web of life with mutual support from the environment, knowing that eventually it will always secure and create a balance. And that's one of the things I talk about a lot when I talk about invasive species. There will be eventually a balance achieved. We just have to understand it and be patient. So now we move into our talk about invasive species and how this all works and you look at the Anishinaabe views on I call it Anishinaabe views on species on the move. And for the Mississauga people, that's what I am. I'm an Anishinaabe person, or you might know us as Ojibwe people, but I'm a Mississauga person, which we are the inhabitants of the shores of Lake Ontario, the North Shore of Lake Ontario. Um, and for our people, we always knew species moved around. Some people call it a migration from region to region, and our people did this as well. We would move around with those species and from our spring and summer and winter hunting grounds, we would travel around our territories. So why wouldn't this be true at a much larger global scale? Right? We've always believed that as the Mississauga people. Things did move around with a purpose. The Mississauga believed that all species could be used and had a place in the ecosystem if you ask through the lens of spirituality. Everything has migrated to an area. We just have to ask, why is it here and how can we coexist together? Right? That's a very different perspective. We talk about invasive species management. How can we coexist together? Granted, there can be some challenges along the way, but we all have a purpose when we come together and serve it together to the natural environment. So let's now talk about what settlers deem as invasive species. Our worldview as an Anishinaabe or Mississauga people believe that every plant in life has a value and a usefulness to it. It's our collective responsibility as the youngest members of this natural family. That means humans being the youngest to show up on the evolutionary scale, to figure out how we can use these species and work together with them. I often find, and I'm not trying to lay blame on anybody, that settler beliefs often exhibit when invasive species show up. Western science tells us that they should be dealt with. If we, the Indigenous people, shared this belief system, then things might look different in the landscape that we call Canada. You came to us as most part and act like an aggressive invasive species, and we still do to this day. But we took pity on you, opened our lands and our waters, and tried to create co-balance with you. And to this day, we're still trying to figure out what is meant by you coming to these lands to teach us, much like the phragmites. I believe some species like phragmites have come to us with a purpose, and we have ignorantly, as Canadians, not asked why. Um, could it be used as a food source? My friends and I and my family members, I'll share this personal story with everybody. And please don't laugh when I do this, when I share this. Um, but we actually looked at it and we're like, hey, the seeds pods really look like quinoa. Well, maybe if we roasted them our traditional way we do wild rice or manoman, we can actually have a food source for people. So my cousins and I and my friends gathered a whole bunch up and we did our traditional ceremonies around roasting them. And then the big moment of truth, we went to eat them. And it turns out you can't eat phragmites, but at least we tried. And, I also brought up the point, maybe it's an alternative fuel source, right? Maybe we can turn the stalks into fuel pellet, like the pellet wood burning stoves. And a lot of people don't know, even in Ontario, Central Ontario and Southern Ontario, most First Nations run on burning wood for the source of heat. In this modern day of different technologies to heat your home, we still use wood because the non-Indigenous community will not share their natural gas pipelines and other ways to heat their homes. We still rely on wood, so maybe this is a source for that, right? We can use that. We don't have to cut down trees anymore. We can use phragmites. So that's one of the things that we often talk about, right? How do we work together and work with these plants? I also look back over this pandemic and see another plant that Settler Society uh, really contests its value to the ecosystem. And I'm speaking about the Manitoba Maple. Every report my community gets to review and talk about invasive species and ways to control invasive species, it talks about eradication of Manitoba maple. And it makes me chuckle a lot because it's interesting because the settler community does not know that that's a prized medicinal plant that my people use. It was one of the first plants when the pandemic first struck that I actually was asked to go harvest for my elders and knowledge keepers. Yet people view it as a nuisance species, right? Over time, since its arrival in our territory, we've asked how to use it and talk to our other family members across this territory and this great land to how do we use it to help our people. And that's what we need to do here with Phragmites. What are we doing that we need, or what are we doing, still doing and need to currently shift to help correct the problems with this perspective and and this land? We still need to understand and work together that these colonizing behaviors that we use in Western science is still leading to environmental degradation and the spread of invasive species. Understand that settlers typically prescribe and substitute for different species that they remove from our landscape. For example, settlers remove bison, we replace them with cattle. We sacrificed Atlantic salmon, lake trout, and brook trout from Lake Ontario and replace them with Pacific salmon, rainbow trout, and brown trout. So to end on, before we open it up for questions and a more wholesome sharing circle, we need to enhance our understanding of practices that still may contribute to the impact of biodiversity and biodiversity conservation and further ecosystem management. Understand the cultural knowledge and value of systems and that underpin certain practices that we do on the landscape. And most importantly, we need to ask for forgiveness to the damage that we have done to this land and that we continue to cause together. And I'd like to say, Chi Miigwech, for your time today, and I will open it to questions.
I suppose I'll open with my first question that CCIS has talked with amongst ourselves. What would you recommend to be the best way that we be reaching out to Indigenous peoples? Because so many our invasive species organizations do run on Western science. How can we reach out to these people to incorporate them into what we're doing?
Oh, that's actually something that a few of my friends and I've been talking about quite a bit, but it is actually starting to create an Indigenous engagement strategy. One of the big things that I would actually say Canadians forget is that when we start applying some of these Western techniques that they could have an impact of our rights as First Nations people, right? And I'm not trying to be critical of anybody, but we need to understand that there is this impact of rights that you might not know because you don't have those rights as non-Indigenous people. So we need to actually have wholesome relationships with Indigenous people, and I would start looking at the major treaty areas of like, you know, for Ontario, like you start with us, you reach out to the Williams Treaty, uh, 7 communities, right, of Central Ontario. Then you start like looking at the Robinson Huron, and then maybe you can start looking at watershed levels because we often lived in watersheds, but you have these plans where you have equal participation by the Indigenous community, and that's really important. We don't want one Indigenous voice. If there's like 9 First Nations, right, that have signatories to that treaty area, then you need to have all 9, right? It's not simple just having one voice. You need all 9 because each First Nation is a different nation and we represent ourselves differently. We might be all related to each other and we're family, but we all have different community goals, especially around environmental conservation.
Thank you. And Courtney says, "Hi, Gary. I love this perspective. Could you speak more on how we balance developing a relationship and finding rules for invasive species like Phragmites with the potential harm?"
Yeah, you know, and each community is different, so they might have a totally different perspective than my own, right? We you know, my people have been removed from the landscape for 100 years with a treaty that was full of lies. The first ever governmental whiteout was used on one of our treaties to renegotiate after we signed it. So we have a different perspective of a healing process than a community that may not have those challenges. And so you need to really strike that conversation up and ask what their local stories are. How do they do things, right? I know this is not prescriptive of Phragmites for sure, but the big one that we're talking about, we have an invasive problem with ticks right now. It's actually the tick problem is so big in central Ontario right now. It's actually superseded our Phragmites challenge that we have, and we haven't been really looking at Phragmites as much as we should be because our ticks are ravaging the landscape essentially. And but we used to do cultural burning. So what are those cultural ecological monitoring techniques that you've now still deemed illegal for us to do? So when I often talk to different regulators, I'm like, hey, I have a person on my team and my staff that her specialty is cultural restoration through prescribed burning. That really makes a lot of people nervous. But if that's the technique you should be using for that area, how can we do it in a good way? And how can we use both knowledge systems to facilitate that conversation, right? You could totally do a traditional cultural thing and still collect Western science data on it. You just need to ask a more wholesome how, right? Don't come to us with a prescribed plan, but actually talk about us and how we used to manage these things. And that's a something that will help us also create like a cultural rejuvenation to a landscape, right? Because there's still a lot, you know, it wasn't until 1978 that a lot of our practices were deemed illegal by Canada. So we need to acknowledge that piece into it as well.
So, next question from Janice. It's along the same lines. What are your thoughts about the impact of Phragmites on wildlife that cannot be moved out of the habitat being overtaken to their detriment? Because Phragmites seems to be a bit of a bully.
Oh, you know, Janice, I was gonna say there's a Europe joke there somewhere, and but yeah, it is something, and it is something we've been asking that question for. Like, you know, we look at some of our turtle species, and some we actually are a community that loves to eat bullfrogs and green frogs, and we're seeing a decrease in those populations across our territory, especially where there is high abundance of Phragmites. Um, and so we're actually looking at trying to how to create solutions around that. It is actually quite a challenge, um, but we're also looking at it from a Western compliance measure. So when you know Western science practitioners prescribe an invasive species management plan for a site in our territory, we'd actually like to see you carry it out. That's one of the biggest challenges we see in the Kawarthas is that people write and prescribe these plans, but there's no one there to enforce its implementation, right? So we do see a lot of soil disruption, seed disruption. You know, we have cottagers coming into our territory, mowing down Phragmites and actually other traditional plants we use, and just creating a whole big mess, right? We're seeing improper restoration techniques where they say, hey, look, we moved a wetland for you, don't worry. And it's like, no, you just moved a bunch of Phragmites. You actually didn't move anything that we wanted, right? So there's a lot of implementation, right? we're still at that cusp where I often say, and I do Western science and I do Indigenous sciences as well. Settlers write great policy. They have no mechanism to monitor and implement them. We need more implementation, monitoring, enforcement. Right? I want to see a fine that will hurt you as a business development person, not just, oh, I once had a person actually tell us he's going to write us a check right there on the spot. And I thought, like, oh my God, right? Like what we're doing isn't working. So we need more of that. We need more enforcement.
All right, a question from Michael. Seeking out the value of species of any origin have for people, examples being fuel and food, can also lead to issues such as overexploitation. Do you have any thoughts on how to guard against this?
Well, so you have to actually, if you're in Ontario, you have to look at the treaty rights of the people that you're working in. So in our treaty area, we actually have in Central Ontario um, that we just settled our treaty in 2018. It was reaffirmed that we had these rights by Canada, and we had apologies by the province, by multiple levels of the province and the federal government, that we have protected through our treaty rights, the protection of certain forest stands, culturally significant forest stands like sugar maple and oak and birch and eastern hemlock, but we've also protected all the wetlands. Every wetland in central Ontario is protected through the treaty. We actually don't need Western science. We just need all of you to know that. And so if we have these implementation measures in place and people understand that, then we can actually work together, right? And that's the challenge piece to it. It's people don't know these things. So you need to research in the treaty, right? We actually, as Indigenous people, wrote the fact that you need to protect the environment from people coming into our territory. Like we actually never signed the rights to water away. So for an example, so any harm settlers do to the waterways in our territory, Central Ontario, that's a violation of treaty, right? Even for you to take a glass of water in Central Ontario is a violation of treaty because you don't have our consent. And who would have thought that, right? I come from a First Nation north of Peterborough with not clean, we don't have clean drinking water. And that's the reality, right? And ironically, the treaty that we possess for the Muskokas and the Parry Sound area, you guys are all going to laugh when you hear this. It actually says white people can't live there. So we definitely know we have to renegotiate that one, right? And we're kind of like out of the all environmental destruction that's happened up there. We're like, you can keep it. It's okay. It's kind of like Toronto. We don't want it back. It's kind of you've done enough. So we need to work on those values for sure and implement treaty in a good way.
So this is a personal question. You have a scientific background, so what was the reason or trigger that made you switch from the more, I suppose, colonial thinking toward invasive species towards your traditional understanding?
That's a good question. I think so. It's always been on like one of the things the elders always told me is that they were breeding me to be one of the bridges between both knowledge systems. And but for me, it was actually when I started having kids, and then I realized, okay, someone needs to show them both sides of this coin to make a difference in Canada, and I think that's what really triggered it. And it got me into more sharing stories like this. And then it's also part of it too was I was stopped being afraid of it. I was no longer afraid to share our values and our culture with all of you. It was actually we grew up teaching that this was a bad thing to share with you and that we could be prosecuted for it. And one day I just said, I'll just do it.
All right. Courtney would like to know, are there any examples of people doing this work in a good way in Southern Ontario that you know of or have been involved in?
Yeah, we're a lot of us are members of the Conservation through Reconciliation Partnership at the University of Guelph. That's where we kind of store some of these ideas, and we're able to work together with Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people to create environmental protection. It started through the Indigenous Protected Areas campaign and the Pathways One target, but we're now start branching out and doing more conservation discussions.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Gary. We really appreciate you coming, joining us, and we really enjoyed your more storytelling style.